My name is Charles Maier. We've been members of this parish and St. Christopher's before that since 1988, when Valerie and I moved to Ottawa from the Yukon. And I'm looking forward to talking to you this morning about the adventure that we're setting off on. And this slide, which is above me, contains one of the quotes that resonated with me from this morning's gospel. It speaks of a less than densely inhabited place. It is beside a river. It's actually the Stuart River. It's not the river of Babylon, and we hope we're not going there to sit down and weep. Valerie and I are heading off there to live for a year or so. We're heading off on the long weekend in August. We are relocating to Mayo as volunteers working for the diocese there and performing what is called a ministry of presence. I'd like to talk to you a bit about Mayo, where we're going, and the ministry of presence in the next few minutes, and I hope you'll not conclude that Valerie and I are completely out of our minds. Valerie and I lived in the Yukon for 8 years before we moved to Ottawa. We were living in Whitehorse, which is at the bottom of the Yukon. There's a little red dot there. It's a city of about 25,000. And we're heading off to Mayo, which is described as being the heart of the Yukon. It's right in the center and 500 kilometers north of Whitehorse. And it's a much smaller place. Mayo is described as the heart of the Yukon, and it's also described as the hottest and coldest spot in the Yukon. It's where Yukon's coldest temperature was recorded of minus 64 Celsius, which apparently translates to 80 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. It has a population of about 400, more or less. It's mainly First Nations people on the banks of the Stuart, which is a tributary of the Yukon, and I was there in December looking into the idea of helping out in the diocese, and the temperature when we were there was minus 40. And I was just back last month, and the temperatures were in the high 20s during the day. It cooled off at night. So Bishop Larry Robertson has been facing a growing challenge in ministering to his Yukon diocese. National funding from the National Church has been falling. Ordained clergy are not available. The bishop sees the ministry of presence as the answer to the church's situation there. Lay people are given accommodations. They become embedded in the small communities that were at one time served by clergy. They represent the church in the community. They offer parish leadership. And the bishop has invited me back in late November to go and see if we might be interested. We traveled to Mayo on the first Sunday in Advent. When we arrived, it was minus 40. The stove had been stoked for 48 hours before the service. I preached with my parka on to about 16 parishioners, and they told the bishop that they would like Valerie and me to come and help out in Mayo. So after some prayerful consideration, we said we would do it for a year, possibly longer. A ministry of presence in Mayo, Yukon. So what is a ministry of presence? Try and clear up some things on that score. It involves getting involved in the community. That's what we're meant to do. It's about accompanying people on their journey through life, inside the church and outside. The bishop has told us that church attendance is only a small part of the job, and it's certainly not the most important one. We're there to be with people on their journey. The picture shows this year's people of Mayo, journeying down the main street of town. Thank you very much. Journeying down the main street of town on the Canada Day, on their Canada Day parade. I'm not sure we would even be considering doing this were it not for the rich environment we have shared here at Epiphany and earlier at St. Christopher's. The ministry of presence is the kind of thing that goes on here at Epiphany all the time. And Valerie and I were noticing yesterday at the Good Food Market the sense in which we're all journeying together as part of the wider community. We heard so many warm conversations going on with all sorts of people, and I think that's the kind of thing that we're meant to be doing. There's a growing body of theological writing as well about the ministry of presence. Theologians Monahan and Renahan speak of this, as you see there, accompanying each person on their journey through life. It's a wonderful challenge. It's also a practical exercise. I was there in June, and there was a lot of hard, old-fashioned work involved. The rectory in Mayo had not been lived in for nearly 2 years. It had settled on the permafrost, the plumbing had become detached, and the walls were cracked. Extensive renovations were required, and I spent the month of June and early July working with the carpenter, plumber doing the work. Lots of hammering, gyprock dust, and paint rollers. The house was a true construction zone. And take note of the IKEA bed in the master bedroom there. You'll see it later on in the slideshow. So there was no pressure on us to get the work done, except that 4 weeks after I got there, the primate was scheduled to do a tour of the diocese with the bishop, and they were down to be our house guests. Primatial accommodations. Here we are. We made good progress. We got most of the drywall work done, and the first coats of paint were up. The furniture was put in place. I had 3 beds made up for the primatial visit. Remember the IKEA bed? Well, I needed to repair it as bits and pieces of it had fallen apart during the years that the house was abandoned. I slept soundly in it 1 or 2 nights before the primate arrived, and His Grace then appreciated being put up in the freshly painted room with the repaired bed. Well, about 3 a.m., there was a loud bump in the primatial quarters. Fred Hiltz assured us the next morning that all was well. Only half of the bed had collapsed. The next morning he went out and scrounged some pieces of wood, and he actually fixed it himself, and it's in really good shape now. He was a great sport. So in spite of the failing support in the primate's bed, I can say that there has been genuine support within the community for what Valerie and I are heading off to do. This is the school for the small community of Mayo. This beautiful new school, which actually was opened by Prince Charles on a royal visit some years ago, serves students from K to 12, 60 students. Education in communities like this is a priority for the government, and it is seen as the antidote to residential schools. Part of the right wing is the local campus for Yukon College, and the college has put together a plan for Valerie and me to use our teaching and our mentoring skills in their adult education programs when we get there in the fall. We see this very much as a part of our getting involved and working in the community. There have been a lot of changes in the Yukon since we were there in the 1980s. Valerie and I were living there. There were no treaties back in the 80s. Land claims were just beginning to be discussed. Today, land claims are largely settled. First Nation bands have a key role to play in government. They have significant funding to promote First Nations development. This building is the administration building for the Mayo band, and they refer to it as their government house. I observed a new sense of pride and self-confidence among First Nation people, and it was very good to see. There's a new First Nation subdivision being built up above the town site of Mayo. Many beautiful homes are going in there. They are built on native lands, and many of Mayo's finest houses are there. Nearly all of them are nicer than the rectory that Valerie and I will be moving into, having rehabilitated the plumbing and the drywall. So what's the role of the church in the new Yukon? To some extent, the church is caught between the old and the new. The church was much involved in the era of the residential schools. It also fought for a better deal for Aboriginals, but it was also part of the darker side of Aboriginal affairs. Bishop Larry Robertson refuses to abandon the small Aboriginal communities at this time. Funding cuts have reduced his paid ordained clergy from around a dozen in the 1990s to only 3 or 4 today. The bishop and the primate shared with me their high hopes for the ministry of presence as a way of keeping a Christian presence alive in Yukon's smaller settlements. When it comes to the ministry of presence, there's no written job description. We have no idea, to be honest, what we're getting into. Just about every preconceived notion I had before I went there proved to be false. Valerie and I will be implementing as we go. The exercise involves a lot of trust in God to show us the way forward to do this. We're told our job is about listening and encouraging, and this is something we have gained some experience of in our involvement here at Epiphany. Keeping a Christian presence in the community is key. The Anglican Church is the only Christian presence in places like Mayo. We hope to encourage local leadership, and our message is we're lay people. Anything we can do as lay people, you can do too. When I was in Mayo, I attended a lot of community events and tried to remember names. I listened to what people had to say, and I assured people that Valerie was coming in September, and of the two of us, she was the nice one. If you want to know what we are really going to be doing in Mayo, talk to her, because she's going to be directing this. The gospel for today had another line that resonated with me somewhat. As he went ashore, he was met by a great crowd. Well, we're assured that that's not going to be a problem in Mayo. Even the primate only managed to draw about 9 people to come out to church. The gospel also talks about Jesus as the shepherd, and we're told in another passage that the sheep recognize the shepherd by his voice. But our ministry is not about crowds, and I do not think it is about having our voices recognized. Our job is to recognize and be attentive to the voices of the people in our community. I was particularly taken by the quotation on the screen assuring us that we do not have to be brilliant Bible scholars, but by being there, by being attentive, and by lending a sympathetic ear, we would be doing what was expected. Just show up and listen, and you exercise the ministry of presence. There's nothing terribly special about what we're doing, and I sincerely believe all of us are doing this kind of thing more often than not in our relations inside and outside the church building. Such being the case, we rely heavily on your prayerful support, and we hope our time in Mayo will help in some small way there. I'd ask you to, if we could now just close with a short prayer. Blessed Savior, who did look with compassion on the multitudes, give your grace to us as we travel together along life's road. Give us ears to hear, a reverence for truth, a passion for peace and justice, and a desire for goodness and the ability to put into action your commitment that we love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Amen.